Welcome, everyone. Before we even get into the material today, I really want to welcome you to the show with a sincere blessing. May God deeply bless your day today, and may He bless your entire week ahead.
Yes, absolutely. We are so thrilled you're joining us.
We really are. Whether you're commuting right now, making breakfast, or just, sitting back with a cup of coffee, we've got something truly fascinating for you.
We're pulling back the curtain on one of the most ancient, heavily debated, and honestly most mysterious texts in human history.
We are. And we've got our hands on the extensive notes from two phenomenal scholarly sources for this deep dive. We're looking at the Holman Study Bible and the NAA Study Bible.
Right.
And today, we are zeroing in on Genesis chapter 6.
And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this specific chapter because, well, it is so much more than the sanitized Sunday school story a lot of us might remember.
Oh, for sure. It usually gets completely smoothed over.
Exactly. Genesis 6 is a massive literary and theological focal point. It's a text where we encounter bizarre ancient warriors. We witness the profound, almost unimaginable grief of the Creator.
Which is a heavy concept in itself.
It really is. And we also find the precise, incredibly advanced mathematics of a massive survival vessel and step right into the center of an intense debate regarding the scope of an ancient, world-altering flood.
So if you are listening right now, whether you consider yourself a history buff, a dedicated theology student, or just someone who loves a good ancient mystery, this chapter matters to you.
Definitely.
It wrestles with the ultimate consequences of human corruption. But it also shows us the absolute length to which grace will go to preserve life in the midst of total disaster.
That's the core of it.
So let's just jump right into the deep end here. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. It starts with a massive controversy.
Right out of the gate.
Right out of the gate. The text mentions the sons of God and the daughters of men. It says, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives.
And naturally, the very first question anyone asks when reading this is, who exactly are the sons of God?
I mean, it sounds like something from a fantasy novel. Who are they?
Well, the study notes lay out three primary theories to explain this strange union. And they don't force a single definitive answer, primarily because scholars have debated this for millennia.
Which is always fun.
It is. The first theory, and perhaps the one that captures the imagination the most, is the fallen angel's view.
Okay, the idea that heavenly beings actually came down and intermarried with human women.
Yes.
To a modern ear, I mean, that sounds like pure science fiction or something straight out of Greek mythology.
It definitely sounds strange to us today, but this view has really deep ancient roots. It's heavily supported by early Jewish traditions.
Like the Book of Enoch, right?
Exactly, like Enoch. And it even seems to be referenced in the New Testament by the apostles Peter and Jude. They both talk about angels who abandoned their proper dwelling and were kept in chains for judgment.
Right. But there's a catch with that one, isn't there?
There is a significant theological hurdle for this theory. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus explicitly states that angels do not marry or reproduce.
They're spiritual beings.
Right, they are spiritual beings, not biological ones with human DNA. So that creates a major puzzle for anyone holding to the fallen angel theory.
Because if Jesus says they don't have that biological capacity, then how could Genesis 6 be about them having children?
Exactly, which leads a lot of scholars to the second theory.
Okay, so if we rule out angels based on that biological argument, what is the second theory looking at?
The second is the tyrannical aristocrats theory.
Tyrannical aristocrats. That sounds, well, a lot more grounded in human history.
It is. In the ancient Near East, kings and rulers were frequently referred to as sons of the gods in their cultural literature. It was a title of absolute authority.
Like the pharaohs in Egypt.
Exactly like the pharaohs. According to this view, these sons of God were not supernatural at all. They were powerful, power-hungry human kings.
So just ruthless Bronze Age tyrants.
Right. Imagine these rulers who abused their absolute authority to build massive harems, simply taking whatever women they wanted.
It paints a picture of unchecked human power and the systemic abuse of the vulnerable by the ancient political elite.
Which perfectly sets the stage for why God judges the earth so harshly later in the chapter.
That paints a very dark but very realistic picture of human history.
Right.
A complete corruption of human leadership.
It really does.
But looking at the Holman notes here, there is a third view that seems incredibly popular among evangelical scholars.
Yes, that would be the lines of Seth and Cain theory.
How does that one work?
Well, to understand this one, we have to look at the larger literary structure of Genesis leading up to chapter 6.
Taking a step back.
Right. The text has just spent time tracing two distinct family trees. First, you have the lineage of Cain, which is depicted as moving further and further away from God.
Descending into violence and pride.
Exactly. Then you have the lineage of Seth, which the text frames as the godly line, where people began to call upon the name of the Lord.
Okay, so you have these two parallel tracks of humanity.
Right. And this third theory argues that the sons of God are the men from that righteous line of Seth.
Oh, I see.
And they compromise their spiritual integrity by intermarrying with the daughters of men, meaning the women from the ungodly line of Cain.
So it's a story about the slow fade of spiritual compromise.
Yeah.
The righteous completely blending in with the corrupt until the entire moral fabric of humanity just disintegrates.
Precisely. It's a theological tragedy of assimilation.
But regardless of which of these three theories you lean toward, the result of these unions is a group of people the text calls the Nephilim.
Yes, the infamous Nephilim.
If you read older translations of the Bible, or even just look at pop culture, the Nephilim are almost always called giants. I mean, I always pictured these towering 30-foot-tall monsters roaming the ancient world.
A lot of people do, but the study notes say that's actually a translation issue.
Wait, really?
Yes, the word Nephilim is actually a transliteration.
Meaning, they didn't translate the meaning of the word into English. They just took the original Hebrew letters and sounded them out in the English alphabet.
Exactly, they just brought the sound of the word over. But the literal translation of the Hebrew root word is fallen ones.
Fallen ones. That carries a completely different emotional weight than just physical height. Why did we ever start calling them giants then?
We can trace that back to the Septuagint. That is the earliest Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, completed by scholars centuries before Christ.
Okay.
When those early Greek translators hit the word Nephilim, they chose a Greek word that meant giants. And that specific translation just stuck in the cultural imagination for thousands of years.
But the original Hebrew text doesn't actually focus on their physical stature.
Not at all. It emphasizes their character and their reputation. The text calls them valiant men of renown or famous warriors of antiquity.
So rather than cartoonish giants, we should be picturing ruthless warlords. Men who made a name for themselves through sheer violence and domination, dragging the rest of humanity down with them.
That is exactly the image the Hebrew text is trying to convey.
But wait, looking at these study notes, it says the Nephilim show up again in the book of Numbers chapter 13, which is long after the flood.
Right, the scout report.
Yeah, the Israelite spies scout out the land of Canaan and come back terrified, saying, "We saw the Nephilim there. We looked like grasshoppers next to them. If the flood wiped everything out, how are the Nephilim walking around in the book of Numbers?"
The study Bibles clarify this beautifully, and it really comes down to understanding the human psychology of the text. We need to be very careful reading Numbers 13.
Because they were being objective.
Right. The spies who brought back that report were panicked, they were terrified, and they fundamentally lacked faith regarding their ability to conquer the land.
So they were exaggerating.
Yes. The scholarly consensus is that those post-flood Canaanites were not actually genetic descendants of the pre-flood Nephilim. No Nephilim survived the flood.
So they were basically using a terrifying legendary term, like calling a modern enemy the boogeyman or a monster, to exaggerate the threat and scare everyone.
Precisely. It was ancient fear-mongering, using a recognizable historical term for terrifying warriors.
That makes so much sense. So, back in Genesis, humanity has reached this point of total violent corruption under figures like these warlords.
And this brings us to the reaction of the Creator.
Right. Genesis says that God repented or was sorry that he had made mankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart.
Which is a very profound statement.
For a lot of people listening, that raises a massive philosophical question. Does an all-knowing God make mistakes? Does he need a do-over?
It's a vital theological nuance, and the answer hinges entirely on the Hebrew word used here, which is nachem.
Nachem. What does that actually convey in the original language?
It does not mean admitting a cognitive error or realizing a mistake was made, the way we might use the word regret today. Nachem implies a profound, heavy grief.
Deep sorrow.
Yes, deep sorrow. It is the emotional pain of a creator seeing their beautiful creation willfully destroy itself.
So it's not, oops, I messed up.
No, not at all. The text explicitly says the wickedness of humanity was so great that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. God isn't surprised by the data. He is brokenhearted by the reality.
The NAA notes provide a really fascinating contrast here to help us understand the unique nature of this grief. They compare the biblical flood account to the Epic of Gilgamesh.
That's a famous ancient Mesopotamian flood myth that actually predates the physical writing of Genesis.
The parallels between the two are interesting, but the contrasts are deeply revealing about the character of God in the Genesis text.
They really are. In Gilgamesh, the pantheon of gods decides to flood the earth for a very specific, mundane reason. The humans were simply multiplying and being too noisy.
Too noisy.
Yeah, the gods couldn't sleep. It's a petty, almost comical motivation.
It's literally like a landlord flooding the entire apartment building just because the upstairs neighbors are playing their music too loud.
That's a great way to put it. But in Genesis, the motivation is profoundly moral. God doesn't send the flood out of annoyance or a divine temper tantrum.
Right. The text portrays the flood as a severe, tragic, and necessary response to a world that had become entirely consumed by violence, exploitation, and evil. It's an act of moral justice, driven by a grieving heart.
But even in the midst of that profound grief, God doesn't just instantly snap his fingers and vaporize the planet.
No, he sets a timeline.
He says, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years.
Which sparks another big debate.
Yeah. Is God saying the maximum human lifespan is biologically capped at 120 years from that point on?
If we look at the genealogical data provided in the text itself, that interpretation doesn't hold up.
Why not?
Well, the study Bibles include a chart of lifespans, and we see that many patriarchs who lived after this declaration lived well beyond 120 years.
Abraham, for example.
Exactly. Abraham lived to be 175.
Okay, so if it's not a biological cap on aging, what is the 120 years?
Scholars argue it is best understood as a countdown. It is a 120-year grace period.
A grace period. Yes. It's God declaring the impending judgment, but giving humanity over a century to change their ways.
But if humanity's thoughts were only evil continually, why give them 120 years? Why not just hit the reset button immediately if the corruption is that absolute?
Because true justice often requires an undeniable demonstration of patience. It provides an extended window for repentance.
To prove they had every chance.
Exactly. And practically, it provides the time necessary for Noah, whom the New Testament later calls a preacher of righteousness, to actually construct the mechanism of salvation.
The ark.
Yes, the ark.
If God is granting this massive 120-year window of grace, he needs someone to actually act on it. And that brings us to Noah. The text says something really beautiful. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord.
And looking at the linguistic notes here, there is an incredible little hidden detail in the ancient language regarding his name.
I love this part.
It is a brilliant piece of Hebrew wordplay. In the original text, the word for Noah is noach, which is spelled with two consonants, nun and chet. And the Hebrew word for grace is chen, which is spelled with the exact same consonants, just reversed, chet and nun.
So Noah's very identity, his very name in the text, is a literal reflection of the grace he receives.
It's beautifully poetic.
It really is. The text also describes Noah with a specific word. It says he was blameless or righteous in his generation. The Hebrew word is tamim.
Tamim, right.
Now, does tamim mean Noah was a sinless, perfect human being who never had a bad thought or made a mistake?
Not at all, and the study notes are very careful to clarify this. Tamim does not mean sinless perfection.
What does it mean then?
The root of the word relates to being whole, integer, or complete. It means Noah was functioning with integrity.
Okay, so in a world that was fractured, violent, and completely broken by the warlords we talked about earlier.
Noah was a whole person who walked faithfully with God. He wasn't morally flawless, but his life was pointing in the right direction while the rest of the world was running the opposite way.
So Noah gets the blueprint to build this vessel of grace. And the dimensions are absolutely wild. As someone who appreciates a good engineering marvel, the notes on the architecture of the ark blew my mind.
The math is fascinating.
God tells Noah to build the ark 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Now, for those wondering, a cubit is an ancient measurement based on the length of a human forearm, from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger.
Right.
So in modern measurements, that's roughly 135 to 140 meters long.
To put that in perspective, that is the length of about 1.5 American football fields.
It's massive.
It is a staggering size for the ancient world, essentially a massive wooden skyscraper laid on its side.
And it's not just big. The math is flawless.
Yeah.
The sources highlight that 300 long by 50 wide, creates a 6-to-1 length-to-width ratio. Why is that specific ratio so critical?
Because that exact 6-to-1 ratio is heavily utilized today in modern shipbuilding.
Today?
Yes, specifically for massive ocean freighters and oil tankers. It is mathematically the perfect proportion for maximum stability in rough, chaotic waters. It severely limits the risk of capsizing.
Right, because the Ark wasn't a sleek speedboat. It didn't have a bow to cut through the waves or a rudder to steer.
No, it wasn't built for navigation.
According to the notes, it had a displacement of around 43,000 tons. And displacement in shipbuilding refers to the actual weight of the water that a ship's hull pushes aside when it's floating.
Which is an incredible amount of weight.
Meaning this wooden box weighed roughly the same as the Titanic.
Wow.
Yeah, it was an incredibly heavy, immovable, ancient survival barge. Its only job was to stay upright.
And the logistical details of the construction are just as intense. Noah is instructed to build it out of gopher wood, which scholars believe was likely a highly durable resinous wood like cypress.
To withstand the water.
Exactly. He's told to coat it with pitch, basically tar or asphalt, both inside and out, to make it completely waterproof. It featured 3 distinct decks to separate the massive cargo and a single 1-cubit window or opening near the roofline.
Just imagine the sensory experience of that. You are locked inside a massive, pitch-black wooden box with only one small window at the very top for ventilation.
It would be incredibly claustrophobic.
You're surrounded by the noise of millions of gallons of crashing water, the groaning of the wood under all that stress, and the overwhelming smell of thousands of animals. It would be absolutely terrifying.
It certainly wasn't a luxury cruise.
Not at all. And speaking of the animals, the text is clear that Noah didn't have to go on a global safari to hunt them down.
Right, he wasn't catching them.
You didn't have to figure out how to trap lions and somehow drag them back to the Middle East. The notes highlight that God said the animals would come to him.
Which underscores the central theological theme here. God is the one orchestrating the salvation of life.
Taking the burden off Noah.
Exactly. He is actively preserving the ecological network through this one remnant, removing the impossible logistical nightmare from Noah's shoulders.
That brings us to the final and perhaps most intense topic our study Bibles tackle. The great debate about the actual floodwaters.
The physical scope of the event.
Right. Did this flood cover the entire globe, plunging Mount Everest underwater? Or was it a regional, localized flood that wiped out the known world of the ancient authors?
This is a debate that has raged for centuries. And both study Bibles present the arguments for both sides quite impartially, recognizing that highly intelligent, faithful scholars hold different views on the physical scope.
Let's start with a global view. What is the primary argument for a worldwide inundation?
The strongest argument for a global flood is the plain, straightforward reading of the biblical text itself.
Just taking the words at face value.
Yes. The language used is extremely absolute. Genesis says that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered and that all flesh perished.
That's pretty sweeping language.
It is. Proponents of this view argue that the intention of the author is clearly universal destruction. Furthermore, they use a very logical argument. If the flood were merely local, God's command to spend 120 years building an ark of that massive scale seems completely unnecessary.
Right. He could have just told Noah to migrate to a different, safer region.
Exactly. Much like he later tells Abraham to leave his homeland. Why build a massive barge if you can just walk away?
That makes a lot of logical sense.
Yeah.
But looking at the regional or local view, what is their counterargument based on the text?
The regional view hinges heavily on ancient language and the geographical perspective of the original audience.
How so?
The Hebrew phrase translated as, all the earth is kol haaretz. However, kol haaretz can just as accurately be translated as the whole land or the entire region.
Oh, that changes things.
It does. We see this specific usage elsewhere in ancient scripture, where all the earth clearly refers to the known inhabited world of the speaker, not the literal planetary globe.
So when the ancient author says the water covered all the high mountains under heaven, they are describing the horizon as far as the human eye or ancient human knowledge could possibly reach.
Exactly. The world as they knew it was entirely destroyed.
What about the scientific side of that argument?
Proponents of the local view also point to significant physical and scientific constraints. They argue that a global flood covering the highest peaks would require an unimaginable amount of water, far more than exists on the planet in any form.
Right.
They also point to the lack of a uniform, globally present geological layer that would definitively prove a simultaneous worldwide inundation.
So where do they think it happened?
They suggest the flood was geographically localized to the Mesopotamian basin where early humanity was densely concentrated. In this view, a regional flood still perfectly achieves the stated goal of wiping out the corrupt human population.
So if you're reading this text today and you're faced with these two very different geographical interpretations, how do the sources synthesize this massive debate?
The key takeaway from our study notes is a warning, really. Getting bogged down in the physical geography can sometimes cause us to miss the actual theology.
Missing the forest for the trees.
Precisely. Regardless of whether the physical scope of the flood was planetary or regional, the theological scope is what the ancient text is desperately trying to communicate.
The ultimate reset button on human corruption.
Exactly. It was a complete, devastating judgment of human violence and a total resetting of humanity through the faith and obedience of one single family.
That's powerful.
It is. The focus of the text isn't to provide a 21st century geology lesson. It's a dramatic revelation of God's hatred for evil and his unrelenting commitment to preserve life through grace.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with the mysterious sons of God and the terrifying Nephilim warlords, exploring the theories of fallen angels, corrupt kings, and compromised spiritual lineages.
We covered a lot.
We did. We looked deep into the heavy, grieving heart of a creator who didn't make a mistake, but who sorrowed deeply over human violence and still offered a 120-year grace period.
The patience of God.
Yeah. We analyzed the brilliant ancient mathematics, the 6-to-1 ratio, and the 43,000-ton engineering of Noah's survival barge. And finally, we navigated the intense debate between a global versus a regional flood, realizing that the ultimate message is one of divine judgment and rescue.
It's a heavy, complex chapter, but it is entirely foundational for understanding the overarching narrative of human history and divine redemption.
It really is.
And before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on regarding the historical reality of this event.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What is it?
In modern genetics and evolutionary biology, there is a widely accepted concept known as a genetic bottleneck.
The genetic bottleneck.
Yes. This is a point in history where the entire human population drastically shrank to a dangerously small number of individuals, perhaps just a few thousand or even less, before expanding again. So knowing that modern science points to humanity surviving a near-extinction level event, and knowing that we have the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Genesis account, could ancient flood narratives be a deeply ingrained, culturally preserved memory of that exact genetic bottleneck?
That completely reframes how you look at both the ancient scriptures and modern science. It suggests that these catastrophic events might be hidden inside the mythologies of cultures all around the world, just waiting for archaeology to rediscover them.
The ancient world is always speaking to us if we just know how to listen.
That is an amazing thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible journey through Genesis 6. Keep asking questions, keep digging deep into the text, and have a wonderful rest of your day. May God bless all the listeners.